Sean Miller didn't hesitate. He snatched my promotion letter, looked me straight in the eyes, and tore them in two, like a wild animal starved for days. The sound of paper ripping echoed across the glass-walled conference room. "Promotion denied," he said flatly, "and effective immediately. Your position is eliminated." Sean Miller, Chief Operating Officer of Northbridge Solutions, had rehearsed this moment. I could tell. His voice was calm, controlled, almost bored, like he was canceling a meeting, not ending a 19-year career. I stared at the torn pieces lying between us. 19 years. That's how long I had worked for Northbridge Solutions, an enterprise technology firm headquartered in downtown Chicago. I joined when we still carried our own servers up the stairs. I stayed through 3 restructurings, 2 mergers, and 1 near collapse that I personally helped stabilize. And now my promotion letter approved, signed, and scheduled to take effect the following quarter was reduced to scrap paper. "You can resign," Sean continued, leaning back in his chair. "We'll offer 3 weeks of severance. Clean exit, no drama." To his left, the CFO avoided eye contact. To his right, HR sat frozen, hands folded. Across from me sat a corporate attorney I'd never met before, silent, observing, already billing by the hour. It was 4:17 on a Friday afternoon. I recognized the pattern instantly. Friday firings were designed to limit damage. No witnesses, no questions, no resistance. Sean slid a folder toward me. Inside was a resignation letter written in my name, my title, my department, my signature line waiting patiently at the bottom. "Sign this," and everything disappears. The promotion, the dispute, my leverage. They were counting on fear, on exhaustion, on the idea that, after 19 years, I'd be too tired to fight. I closed the folder. "I'll resign," I said. Relief flashed across Sean's face quick, careless. "But I'll write my own letter." The room went completely still. Sean frowned. Just slightly. He didn't know it yet. But that sentence was the most expensive mistake he would ever make. If this moment stirred something in you, anger, calm, or just recognition, I hope you're holding up well as the new year begins. And I truly wish you steady strength and peace in the months ahead. Tell me where you're listening from right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you'd like to stay with me as this unfolds, consider subscribing, because what happened next is where everything truly changed. My name is Evelyn Hart. For 19 years, I worked my way up from a junior operations analyst to senior director of enterprise operations. I wasn't flashy. I didn't chase titles. I built systems, quiet ones, the kind that keep companies alive long after the people who designed them are forgotten. By the time Sean Miller arrived as Chief Operating Officer, my department oversaw operational workflows across 4 regions. My team supported contracts worth just over $58 million annually. I wasn't a public figure inside the company. I was something more dangerous. I was the one people called when things broke. When a legacy client threatened to walk, my phone rang. When finance couldn't explain why a process existed, I explained it. When auditors asked why a workaround from 2008 still mattered, I showed them where it lived and why removing it would collapse everything downstream. Sean didn't like that. He arrived 18 months earlier after Northbridge was acquired by Crestline Holdings, a private equity group obsessed with efficiency and allergic to experience. Sean was young, confident, and aggressively certain that everything older than him was obsolete. He believed institutional memory was clutter. He believed loyalty was replaceable, and he believed I was expensive. The changes started quietly. Meetings I'd led for years were suddenly restructured. My calendar invites disappeared. Responsibilities I'd built were reassigned to managers who didn't understand them. Once, during a leadership meeting, Sean laughed and said, "We don't need people who remember how things used to work. We need people who move fast." Everyone laughed. I didn't. Instead, I started documenting every exclusion, every reassignment, every comment that mentioned fresh energy, new blood, or cost alignment. I didn't warn anyone. I didn't confront Sean. I just kept doing my job and keeping records. By the time the promotion letter was approved, I already knew it wouldn't survive him. The letter wasn't a reward. It was proof that my performance was undeniable, and that removing me would require something messier than incompetence. That's why he tore it up himself. He wanted control, he wanted speed. And most of all, he wanted me gone before I could remind him what I actually knew. What Sean Miller didn't understand was simple. I wasn't dangerous because I was emotional. I was dangerous because I was prepared. And the letter I handed back to him that afternoon was never meant to end things quietly. I left the building at 5 o'clock sharp. No escort, no dramatic goodbye, just a security badge that stopped working halfway to the elevator and a quiet nod from the receptionist, who suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. 19 years ended without applause. At home, I set the box down in my living room and didn't open it. I poured a glass of water instead of wine and sat on the edge of the couch, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. That kind of silence only comes after something irreversible. My phone vibrated. Once. Twice. Then again. I didn't answer. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew better. The first messages came from my team. Short, confused. Are you okay? What just happened? Did this come from Sean? Then came the emails. Calendar invites canceled. Automated notifications informing me my access had been revoked. A sterile message from IT reminding me to return my laptop within 48 hours. Everything moved fast. Too fast. That was the first sign. Companies that are confident don't rush. They pause. They document. They protect themselves. What Northbridge did instead was panic cleanup, wiping surfaces before anyone could see what had been disturbed. I spent that evening doing something Sean never imagined. Nothing. I didn't send emails. I didn't post online. I didn't call anyone at the company. I let them sit with the quiet. By Monday morning, the silence had shifted. At 7:32, my phone rang. Unknown number, Chicago area code. I let it go to voicemail. Ms. Hart, this is Daniel Ross, the voice said carefully. I represent Northbridge Solutions. Please call me back as soon as possible regarding your resignation. Resignation. That word again. I listened twice. Then deleted the message. 10 minutes later, another call, then another, by noon. I had 6 missed calls and 3 emails, all polite, all urgent, all asking the same thing in slightly different language. They wanted clarification. That was the second sign. Clarification is what people ask for when they've realized something doesn't mean what they thought it did. I finally called back at 2:15. Daniel Ross answered on the first ring. His voice was tight, controlled the voice of someone already in trouble. There seems to be some ambiguity, he began, regarding the effectiveness of your resignation. I smiled for the first time since Friday. There isn't, I said calmly. You just didn't read it closely. There was a pause. Papers rustled on the other end of the line. What exactly do you believe your current status is? He asked. I believe, I replied, that I'm still employed. The silence that followed was not empty, it was heavy. And somewhere inside Northbridge Solutions, someone was finally realizing that tearing up a promotion letter had triggered something far more expensive. If you were me at this moment, what would you do? Leave a comment below. Daniel Ross didn't argue. That alone told me everything. Instead, he cleared his throat and said, Ms. Hart, perhaps we should walk through the language together. Walk through the language. That was lawyer speak for we didn't expect this. I'm happy to, I replied. Which sentence would you like to start with? There was another pause. I imagined him sitting in a windowless office, resignation letter spread open on his desk, a yellow highlighter hovering uselessly above words that suddenly carried weight. The phrase effective upon receipt of full and complete settlement. He said slowly, Can you explain your interpretation? My interpretation isn't unique, I answered. It's contractual. Effective upon means conditional. Until the condition is met, the action doesn't take effect. You're saying your resignation hasn't taken effect yet, he said. I'm saying, I corrected gently, that my resignation becomes effective only after Northbridge fulfills all financial and contractual obligations owed to me. Silence again. Longer this time. What obligations are you referring to? Daniel asked, his voice noticeably tighter. All of them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't rush. I let the words land one by one. Final salary through separation, accrued vacation, outstanding reimbursements, performance bonus eligibility under my 2018 contract amendment, and severance entitlements triggered by termination following a change in control. He exhaled sharply. That's a significant list, he said. It's accurate, I replied. And documented. The next sound I heard wasn't his voice. It was someone else in the room with him whispering urgently, too quietly to make out words, but loud enough to confirm he wasn't alone anymore. They were looping people in. That clause, Daniel said carefully, may require internal review. Of course, I said. Take your time. Just remember until it's resolved. I remain an employee. Your system access has already been terminated, he said quickly, as if testing a boundary. Then I suggest you restore it, I answered, because locking out an active employee tends to complicate things. Another pause. Papers shuffled again. I'll need to consult with senior leadership, Daniel said. I assumed you already were, I replied. The call ended politely, almost professionally. 27 minutes later. My email access was restored. No explanation, no apology, just a quiet reversal. That was the moment I knew Sean Miller had finally been briefed, and that the confidence he wore on Friday afternoon was gone. Because executives don't reverse actions unless someone tells them they've stepped into risk. Real risk. And risk has a way of exposing who made the call, and who failed to read the fine print. I closed my laptop and waited. They would call again, and next time. They wouldn't be asking questions. The call came just after 9:30 the next morning. This time, it wasn't a lawyer. Evelyn. The voice snapped the moment I answered. What did you do? It was Sean Miller. The calm authority he'd worn in the conference room was gone. In its place was something tighter brittle. He didn't bother with pleasantries. I resigned, I said evenly. Exactly as you asked. You know that's not what I mean, he shot back. Legal is saying your resignation hasn't taken effect, that you're still technically employed. That's impossible. It's inconvenient, I corrected. Not impossible. You're playing games, he said. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. No, I replied. I'm reading what I signed. He exhaled sharply, the sound of someone pacing. The board is asking questions, he continued. Crestline is involved now. They want to know why we're suddenly exposed to obligations. Obligations. Not wrongdoing, not misconduct, just money. How much did they tell you? I asked. There was a pause. Short. Telling. Legal is still calculating, he said. Then they haven't reached the expensive part yet. His voice dropped. This doesn't have to get ugly. That was the line. It always comes right before things do. I was offered 3 weeks of severance after 19 years, I said calmly. You tore up my promotion letter. You removed my role. And now you're surprised I didn't do this quietly. You should have come to me, he snapped. I did, I replied. For years. You just didn't listen. The line went silent for a beat. Then he tried a different approach. What do you want? He asked. I didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, I didn't want anything new. I wanted exactly what had already been promised in writing. Over time. With signatures they now wished they could erase. I want what my contract says, I said. Nothing more. That contract is outdated, he argued. It's binding, I replied. And it survived the acquisition. Another voice broke in on his end. Muted, urgent. He covered the phone, didn't hang up. They were arguing, when he came back. His tone had shifted again, controlled, but thinner. You understand this affects more than just you, he said. I understand, I answered. That decisions have consequences. He didn't respond, because somewhere between Friday afternoon and Tuesday morning, Sean Miller had realized something crucial. This wasn't a negotiation he controlled. It wasn't a situation he could override with authority. And it certainly wasn't going away. When the call ended, I sat quietly, phone still warm in my hand. The pressure had reached the top. And once it does, it never stops rolling downhill. At this point, do you feel something is about to happen? The lawyer called that afternoon. Not Daniel Ross. This one introduced himself carefully, with a tone that carried weight. Ms. Hart, my name is Michael Grant. I'm external counsel retained by Crestline Holdings. That explained the urgency. Private equity firms don't panic easily. They calculate. And when they bring in outside counsel, it means internal explanations have failed. We've reviewed your resignation letter, he continued. Specifically, the conditional language. I assumed you would, I said. There are financial implications, he admitted. We need to understand your position clearly. I've been very clear, I replied, but I'm happy to walk you through it. I opened the folder I'd prepared weeks earlier. Inside were spreadsheets, contract excerpts, email approvals, and a timeline that stretched back nearly 2 decades. Every line item had a source. Every number had a justification. Start with compensation, Michael said. Of course, I answered. I explained my final salary obligations, then accrued vacation, then unreimbursed expenses from a client implementation trip that accounting had delayed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing unusual. Then I moved on. My employment agreement includes a performance bonus clause, I said. 80% of base salary, payable if operational targets are met. Targets were exceeded. He didn't interrupt. Additionally, I continued, the change in control triggered enhanced severance protections that's outlined in the 2018 amendment. Section 7. There it was. The amendment Sean never read. The severance provision guarantees continued compensation and benefits if my role is eliminated within 24 months of acquisition, I said calmly, which it was. Michael exhaled slowly. And your interpretation, he asked, is that all of this must be paid before your resignation becomes effective? Yes. That total is substantial. It's precise, I corrected. There was a pause. Not confusion, calculation. I need to be transparent, he said. Your number exceeds initial estimates. That tends to happen, I replied, when experience is treated like overhead. He didn't argue. Instead, he asked for documentation. I sent it within minutes. Emails approving my promotion, signed compensation schedules, internal reports showing performance metrics, contract language highlighted, cross-referenced, time-stamped by the time we ended the call. His tone had shifted again, no longer probing, but cautious. We'll need time, he said. Take it, I replied. Just remember, time doesn't pause accrual. That was the part they hated, because every day that passed, the numbers grew, not dramatically, not explosively, relentlessly. That evening, my system access was fully restored. Email, internal dashboards, benefits portal, no announcement, no explanation, just quiet compliance. Someone, somewhere, had finally done the math. And once numbers start speaking louder than authority, power changes hands very quickly. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no company-wide email, no sudden apology, no dramatic reversal. What changed was subtler than that, and far more telling. On Thursday morning, my calendar quietly repopulated. Meetings I had been excluded from for months appeared again without explanation. Risk reviews, operational oversight sessions, executive alignment calls. No one asked whether I planned to attend. The system simply assumed my presence. That assumption mattered. It meant someone higher up had intervened. Within hours, internal behavior began to shift. Decisions slowed. Approvals stalled. Conversations that used to move quickly now required confirmation. When an organization pauses like that, it's usually because authority has been interrupted. By midday, it became clear why. The board had stepped in, not to negotiate, not to apologize, to assess damage. Crestline Holdings, the firm that acquired Northbridge, had begun asking questions, not abstract ones, but very specific ones about timing, documentation, approvals, and why legal exposure had not been identified earlier. They weren't interested in personality conflicts or leadership philosophy. They wanted to know how a routine termination had escalated into a financial and legal risk. Every answer led back to the same moment: the promotion letter, the meeting, the decision to move fast. What followed was predictable. Executives who had been confident days earlier became careful. Emails were reread, calendars were scrutinized, past decisions were reframed as misunderstandings. Responsibility began drifting upward and then, quietly, sideways. Sean Miller's role changed without being formally announced. Operational authority was no longer centralized through him. Reviews that once required his sign-off were redirected. Requests were delayed under the pretense of temporary oversight. In corporate language, it was described as a pause. In reality, it was containment at the same time. Communication toward me softened. Messages became more precise. Language shifted from finality to flexibility. References to resignation were replaced with phrases like current status and interim considerations. That shift told me everything I needed to know. They were no longer trying to remove me. They were trying to stabilize around me. By the end of the week, a board representative reached out, not a lawyer, not HR, but someone whose role existed solely to reduce exposure. The tone was neutral, measured, and deliberately impersonal. They asked for clarification on expectations and outcomes, not emotions or history. I gave them exactly what I had given everyone else: consistency. I reiterated that my position had not changed, that my resignation was conditional, and that until obligations were fulfilled, my employment remained intact. I explained that litigation was not my objective, but that avoidance required compliance, not improvisation. That was the moment momentum fully reversed. Once the board becomes involved, speed stops favoring executives. It favors documentation, process, risk minimization, and most of all, accountability. By Friday morning, the silence around Sean Miller was unmistakable. People avoided his office. Meetings were rescheduled. Authority fragmented. Because when the board steps in, someone always pays for the mistake, and it's rarely the person who documented everything. By the following Monday, the tone had fully changed. There were no more casual messages, no assumptions, no rushed decisions framed as inevitabilities. Everything that came from Northbridge now carried the careful weight of review. Emails were shorter, more formal. Meetings were scheduled with agendas attached. Legal counsel was copied on nearly every exchange. That kind of structure only appears when an organization has realized it crossed a line. The first formal settlement discussion arrived mid-morning. Routed through external counsel rather than internal leadership, it wasn't presented as an admission of fault, but it didn't need to be. The language alone told the story. Words like resolution, mutual closure, and risk mitigation appeared where transition and exit once stood. They were no longer managing an employee departure. They were managing exposure. What struck me most wasn't the amount initially proposed, it was the speed. Only days earlier, they had assumed the situation would resolve itself quietly. Now they were moving with urgency, attempting to cap consequences before they expanded further. The documentation I had provided was circulating. Contracts were being reread, amendments resurfaced. Internal approvals, once treated as routine, were now being examined as binding commitments. Every signature carried a name. Every date carried context. And context, I had learned, is what collapses confident narratives. The settlement framework they floated focused on finality, a clean severance, mutual non-disparagement, confidentiality clauses designed to lock the story in place. It was presented as practical, efficient, and beneficial for all involved. What it did not address was leverage, because leverage doesn't disappear simply because someone asks nicely. The conditional nature of my resignation remained intact until obligations were met. Employment status did not change. Benefits continued. Accruals continued. Risk remained open-ended. That reality was beginning to unsettle the right people. Crestline Holdings, increasingly visible behind the scenes, was pressing for certainty, not because they sympathized with me, but because uncertainty is poison to investment structures. Unresolved liabilities disrupt forecasts. They invite scrutiny. They slow exits. The pressure, once aimed outward, had turned inward. Internal accountability reviews were underway. Decision chains were being reconstructed. What had once been framed as decisive leadership was now being reclassified as procedural failure. Sean Miller's role in accelerating the termination without full review was no longer protected by confidence or rank. It was being examined carefully. By the end of the week, the settlement conversation returned revised, expanded, and far more detailed. The numbers were higher, the conditions more precise, the urgency unmistakable. They wanted closure, what they were learning, slowly and uncomfortably. Was that closure as expensive when preparation meets impatience? And while they recalculated, I waited, because this phase was never about emotion or vindication. It was about arithmetic, and arithmetic, unlike authority, does not bend. The final proposal arrived on a Thursday evening, not as a casual email, but as a structured package, schedules attached, clauses numbered, language polished to the point of sterility. It had passed through too many hands to feel personal. That was intentional. Personal motives complicate settlements. Precision closes them. The numbers had changed, significantly. What began as a narrow severance discussion had expanded into a full accounting of obligations, salary continuation, accrued benefits, performance compensation tied to metrics they could no longer dispute, reimbursements delayed but documented, provisions triggered by the acquisition they preferred not to revisit. Each category was now treated as non-negotiable. The remaining discussion wasn't about whether payment was owed. It was about scope and timing, how quickly exposure could be neutralized, and under what conditions the file could be closed without reopening risk. Confidentiality clauses were strengthened. Mutual non-disparagement language was revised multiple times. Narrowing definitions, removing ambiguity. They wanted certainty that the story would not travel beyond the boundaries they could manage. In exchange, they offered something they hadn't before. Acknowledgement, not an apology, not an admission, but written confirmation that my departure was not performance-related and that my contributions to Northbridge Solutions were substantial, sustained, and valuable. The language was careful, but unmistakable. That sentence mattered more than they understood. The final sticking point was timing. They wanted immediate effectiveness, immediate resignation, immediate closure. What they received instead was conditional finality. The agreement made it explicit obligations first, separation second. Payment schedules were tied to execution milestones. Until completion, status remained unchanged. It was the same structure they had overlooked before, now embedded beyond removal. Legal counsel reviewed every line. External advisors flagged risks they had missed weeks earlier. The pace slowed not because of hesitation, but because mistakes were no longer affordable. By the time the final version was circulated, the tone had lost all urgency. This was no longer a negotiation, it was a conclusion. Signatures followed in sequence, not ceremonially, not together. Names appeared on pages at different times, from different offices. The last signature came from Crestline's side, not Northbridge's. That distinction mattered too. Funds were scheduled, confirmations issued, access timelines clarified, benefits adjusted, everything documented, time-stamped, archived. Only then did my resignation become effective. Not because someone declared it so, but because conditions had been met. The next morning, my calendar cleared again. This time, intentionally. No meetings returned, no access restored, no ambiguity remained. The system had resolved itself. And somewhere inside Northbridge Solutions, the cost of moving too fast had been calculated, approved, and absorbed, quietly. The aftermath didn't arrive all at once. It never does. At first, there were only small ripples of delay here, a pause there. Projects that once moved smoothly began to stall. Decisions that used to be routine required review, then revision, then approval from people who hadn't been part of the original design. Institutional memory is invisible until it's gone. Northbridge didn't collapse. Companies rarely do in dramatic fashion. What it did instead was slow. Quietly, persistently. The kind of slowing that investors notice long before employees do. Sean Miller lasted another 6 months. Officially, his departure was framed as a strategic transition. Unofficially, it followed an internal review that concluded certain decisions had exposed the company to unnecessary risk. No one mentioned the promotion letter. No one needed to. The people who mattered understood. As for me, the silence after separation felt different from the silence after termination. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't tense. It was clean. The kind of quiet that comes when something has been resolved properly. I didn't celebrate. I didn't announce anything. I closed the folder, archived the documents, and moved on. That was always the point. The lesson wasn't about revenge or clever language. It wasn't about winning or watching someone else lose. It was about understanding how value actually works inside organizations and how quickly it's dismissed by those who mistake speed for intelligence. Experience isn't loud. Preparation isn't dramatic. Leverage rarely announces itself. It waits. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own story, I hope you're doing okay. I hope you're taking care of yourself as this new year begins, not rushing, not doubting your worth just because someone else failed to see it. Wherever you're listening from, know this: what you've built matters more than titles, more than timing, more than someone else's impatience. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to fight loudly. It's to stay calm, document carefully, and let the system reveal exactly what it owes you. When I look back on everything that happened, the biggest lesson isn't about contracts or clever wording. It's about knowing your worth quietly, even when someone else tries to erase it in a moment. Real value is built over time in consistency, preparation, and integrity, and no one can tear that away with a single decision. Emotionally, I learned that staying calm is not weakness. It's often the strongest form of self-respect. Humanly, this story reminded me that many of us carry unseen weight from years of effort, and we deserve fairness, not fear. If you've stayed with me until the end, thank you. It truly means more than you know. Have you ever faced a moment like this in your own life? If you're comfortable, I'd love for you to share your story. Where are you listening from today? Please leave a comment. Tap like if this resonated. Share it with someone who might need it. And consider subscribing so we can keep having these honest conversations together.